James Carter was exhausted. The day had been long, filled with meetings, classes, and a pile of assignments he hadn't yet tackled. But the thought of his mother, Helen, suffering at home with her illness, had kept him going. She had been bedridden for days, and he'd been doing everything he could to care for her. He stopped by the pharmacy to pick up her medication, grabbed a few groceries, and rushed home to check on her. His concern was genuine, as was his desire to make her as comfortable as possible. When he arrived at their apartment complex, he saw the parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there. He knew Helen could barely walk, so he searched for the closest spot to the building. As he drove down the row, he spotted one of the spots near the entrance, open and empty, just a short distance from the building's door. It seemed perfect. Without thinking much of it, he pulled in and parked, figuring he'd be in and out in a matter of minutes. After all, the parking lot wasn't crowded, and he wasn't taking up anyone's designated spot. He grabbed the bags of groceries and his mother's prescription, locking the car as he made his way toward the apartment entrance. But as he stepped out of the car, a voice called out from behind him. James turned, and there she was, the last person he expected to confront him. A woman in her late 50s, wearing an apron and gardening gloves, stormed out of the building's entrance. Gloria Michaels, the local HOA enforcer, had been known for her obsessive control over everything in the neighborhood, especially parking spaces. No one dared park in what she had long proclaimed was her spot. She marched toward James, her face twisted in a scowl. "Excuse me," Gloria shouted, hands on her hips. "What do you think you're doing, parking there?" James blinked in confusion, his grip tightening on the grocery bags. Sorry. I'm just dropping off my mom. She's sick, and I thought this spot was closest to the entrance. I won't be here long, just a few minutes." Gloria didn't seem to care. "That's not the point. You can't just park wherever you feel like it. You're blocking my spot. I pay for this space, and I don't appreciate people ignoring the rules." James glanced at the nearly empty parking lot. "There are plenty of other spots open. I didn't realize this one was yours. It's my spot, and you don't get to decide where to park. You think just because you're dropping off your mom, you can park anywhere? This is a private parking lot. If you don't move your car, I'll report you to the HOA." James tried to keep his voice calm. "Look, I'm sorry. I'll move it in a second. It won't be a problem." But Gloria wasn't listening. She was already approaching her porch, continuing to rant about how disrespectful people were becoming. James was frustrated, but he didn't want to escalate things. He turned back to the car and was about to open the door when he heard her shout again. James opened the car door, his fingers brushing the handle when Gloria's voice rang out once more, this time sharper, more insistent. "I said move it now. This is my spot. Don't make me get the HOA involved." James felt his patience wearing thin. He had done nothing wrong, he wasn't blocking anyone's spot, and his mother was waiting inside, sick and needing care. But Gloria was relentless. She marched back toward him, her face now flushed with rage. "I've been living here longer than anyone," she continued, "and I've never had to deal with such disrespect. You don't get to park in my spot just because it's convenient for you. This is my property, and I'll be damned if I let people like you take advantage of it." James held up his hands, trying to calm the situation. "Look, I said I'm sorry, okay? I'm moving my car. There's no need to make a big deal out of this." But Gloria wasn't backing down. Her posture stiffened, and her jaw clenched. "You people think the rules don't apply to you. Well, I'll show you how wrong you are. You're going to learn some respect, starting with my parking spot." Before James could respond, Gloria did something unexpected. She reached into her bag, pulling out something metallic and gleaming. A gun. James' breath caught in his throat. His hands froze in place. He had no idea what to do. What are you doing? James stammered, taking an instinctual step back. Gloria raised the gun, pointing it directly at James' chest, her eyes wide with fury. I'm doing what I have to do to protect what's mine, she screamed, her finger tightening on the trigger. The gunshot rang out, so sudden and deafening that it felt as if the world had stopped. The pain hit James almost instantly, like an explosion in his shoulder, knocking him back against the side of the car. He gasped for air, his legs buckling beneath him as he crumpled to the ground, the sharp sting of the bullet sending waves of agony through his body. His vision blurred, his breath ragged. Blood soaked through his shirt, pooling beneath him on the asphalt. Helen, still inside, heard the gunshot, felt it in her bones. Her heart stopped. She couldn't breathe as she rushed toward the door, frantic, terrified of what might be waiting outside. James, she cried out, her voice breaking as she stumbled toward him. Gloria, still holding the gun, stood over him, her expression unreadable. You shouldn't have parked in my spot, she muttered coldly. As James gasped for air, his thoughts became a haze of pain and disbelief. The woman who had caused so much tension over something so trivial had just shot him. He couldn't process it. Couldn't understand how it had come to this. But he could feel the blood draining from his body, and as the world around him darkened, the last thing he heard was his mother's desperate cry as she reached his side. The world seemed to freeze as the cold, metallic gleam of the gun in Gloria's hand reflected the afternoon sun. James Carter felt his heart race, the rapid thudding in his chest drowning out all other sounds. His mind was flooded with confusion. How had it come to this? One moment, he was just trying to park to help his mother, and now, the woman across from him, whose entire sense of power rested in her obsessive need to control her small corner of the world, was holding a gun. Gloria, put the gun down. James shouted, his voice unsteady, panic rising in his throat. But Gloria's eyes were wild, her hands shaking as she tightened her grip on the weapon. I've had enough of people thinking they can do whatever they want, she screamed, her voice full of rage. This is my space, my rules. You'll learn respect, even if I have to teach it the hard way. James took a step back, his feet stumbling as he tried to keep his distance. His hand instinctively moved toward the car door, his only hope to get inside, lock it, and drive away. But before he could even think, the air was shattered by the deafening sound of a gunshot. The force of the bullet hitting his shoulder felt like an explosion. His breath caught in his throat as his body lurched forward. Pain flooded through him, intense and overwhelming. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The world spun, and he collapsed to the ground beside the car, his blood soaking through his clothes and pooling beneath him. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but the pain stole his breath, and everything around him blurred. Gloria stood there, staring at the weapon in her hand, as though it had a mind of its own. Her breathing was ragged, her body stiff with adrenaline. The shock of what she had just done slowly crept into her expression, but her eyes never lost their icy edge. It was as though she had already justified the violence in her mind. James gasped for air, his vision dimming, his head spinning. He could hear his mother's voice now, distant but growing louder. James. James, no. Helen's scream echoed in his mind as the last remnants of awareness slipped away. Helen Carter had never imagined she'd find herself in a situation like this. One moment, she was inside, trying to settle down for a quiet evening after a long day of being ill. The next moment, the world exploded with the sound of a gunshot. Her heart leaped into her throat as she ran to the door, fear crashing over her in waves. The shrill sound of her son's cry, followed by the deafening shot, had left her paralyzed for a moment. But now, she could no longer afford to be frozen in shock. She had to get to him. Helen's legs moved before she had a chance to think. She burst through the door, only to find James crumpled on the pavement, blood staining his shirt. His face was pale, his eyes wide with pain and shock. He was lying motionless, and the sight of him in such a vulnerable state brought every motherly instinct rushing to the surface. "James," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she reached for him. Her fingers hovered over the gash in his shoulder, and she could feel the blood seeping through her own clothes as she pressed her hand to his wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But the blood kept coming, too much, too quickly. "Mom, I'm sorry," James whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes fluttered, the life draining from them as the pain began to overwhelm him. "No, don't say that," Helen cried, her voice desperate, her eyes frantic. She leaned over him, pressing her forehead to his. She felt the weight of the moment, the terror, the loss, the disbelief, but she couldn't let herself crumble. She couldn't lose him. Her heart hammered in her chest as she desperately searched for her phone, her hands fumbling through the pockets of her jacket. The pain of seeing James like this was more than she could bear, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't waste any more time. "Please, God, please," she whispered, her eyes squeezing shut. "Help me get him through this." Helen finally found her phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. "Please, we need help. My son's been shot, please send an ambulance. We're at, address." Her voice broke as she repeated the address, her entire being consumed by the terror of what had just happened. The phone call felt like an eternity. The seconds stretched, each one filled with fear, as she knelt beside her son, holding his bleeding body. His breathing was shallow, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness. "James, stay with me, please," she whispered through clenched teeth, her hands pressing harder against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the flow of blood. Her voice was trembling, but she forced herself to keep calm. She had to keep him alive. She couldn't let him die like this, not over a parking spot. The sound of running footsteps broke through Helen's fog of fear. She turned her head just in time to see her neighbor, Rachel Flynn, rushing toward her, her face pale with shock. Rachel had heard the gunshot and immediately come outside to see what had happened. "Oh my God, Helen!" Rachel cried, kneeling beside her. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The blood soaking James's shirt told the story all too well. Rachel's hands were shaking as she grabbed a nearby towel from the bench near the door and pressed it onto James's wound, trying to help with the bleeding. "I called 911. They're on their way," she said, her voice unsteady. Helen nodded, her chest tight with anxiety. "Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much." Rachel looked up at her, her eyes full of concern. "Is he?" Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the question. "I don't know," Helen replied quietly, her voice breaking. She felt completely powerless, her heart breaking as she watched James slip further away. She didn't know what to do. She had never felt more helpless in her life. They continued to apply pressure to the wound, but it seemed as if every second that passed was one step closer to losing him. The blood still flowed, and James's face grew paler by the minute. "I can't lose him, Rachel. I can't lose my son," Helen whispered, her tears falling onto his face. She couldn't think of a time in her life when she had ever felt this terrified, this helpless. Rachel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Helen, we're doing everything we can. Help is coming. You're not alone in this." But deep down, Helen knew the truth: no one could save James except for the paramedics who would soon arrive. And until they did, all she could do was hold on to him, hold on to her son, and pray that the help would come in time. The sharp sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder and louder with every passing second. Helen held James's limp body in her arms, trying desperately to hold on to any thread of hope. Her heart raced, and her hands shook violently, but she continued to apply pressure to the wound, praying that it would be enough until the paramedics arrived. Each passing second felt like an eternity as she looked down at her son, blood staining his clothes and pooling beneath him. Just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the police car screeched to a halt in front of the building. Two officers leapt out, their eyes quickly scanning the scene. Officer Nathaniel Brooks was one of the first to approach, his calm, authoritative presence a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding before him. "Ma'am, what happened?" Officer Brooks asked, his voice gentle but firm as he kneeled beside Helen. His eyes immediately focused on the wound, and he motioned for his partner to grab the medical kit. She shot him," Helen stammered, her voice barely audible through her panic. "Gloria, she shot my son." Officer Brooks's eyes narrowed, and he nodded, signaling to his partner, who quickly radioed for paramedics. "Stay with him, ma'am. Help is on the way." Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. Her body felt numb as she continued to press her hands against James's wound, trying to stop the blood, but it was no use. He was slipping away, and every time he gasped for breath, it sounded weaker. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks was scanning the area, his eyes immediately landing on Gloria, who stood just a few feet away, still holding the gun in her trembling hand. Her face was a mixture of shock and anger, but there was no remorse in her eyes. "Ma'am, put the gun down," Officer Brooks commanded, his voice now sharp and commanding. Gloria hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered the weapon, but her posture remained defensive, as if she were still ready to argue her case. As the paramedics arrived, quickly moving James onto a stretcher and rushing him toward the waiting ambulance, Officer Brooks turned his attention to Gloria. The officers quickly handcuffed her, reading her rights as she was placed under arrest. Gloria's eyes were wide with disbelief, but her lips were set in a tight, stubborn line. She didn't seem frightened, she seemed annoyed. It was as if this entire situation was beneath her. "I was just protecting my space," Gloria said loudly, her voice quivering with frustration. "He parked in my spot. It's not just a parking space, you know. People have no respect anymore. No respect for the rules. I warned him, and he didn't listen." Officer Brooks took a deep breath, his eyes flickering with disbelief. He had handled his fair share of neighborhood disputes, but this was different. "Ma'am, you shot him. With a gun. You didn't just tell him to move his car, you shot him." Gloria didn't flinch. "I had no choice. He wasn't listening, and he was disrespecting me. That's my spot. I've worked hard to get that space. And you know what? If he wasn't going to respect me, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me." Her words dripped with entitlement, each one soaked in self-righteous anger. But Officer Brooks could see through it. There was no legitimate reason for a shooting here. No justification for using deadly force in a simple dispute over a parking space. Gloria continued to ramble as she was escorted to the police car. "I was just defending myself, protecting what's mine. He was on my property. I felt threatened, and I acted in self-defense." "I'm going to need you to stop talking, ma'am," Officer Brooks interjected firmly. "You'll have a chance to explain yourself later. But right now, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." As Gloria was pushed into the back of the police car, Officer Brooks shook his head, his mind racing through the details of the situation. This was far from a simple neighborhood dispute. There was something more to this, something darker, and he was going to make sure it was uncovered. As the police continued their investigation, Rachel Flynn, a neighbor who had witnessed the entire incident from her window, was called to give her statement. She stepped into the small police station, her face pale, her hands wringing in front of her. She was visibly shaken, but the officers assured her that her statement was vital to the case. "I've lived next door to Gloria for years," Rachel began, her voice tight. "She's always been a little difficult. Always barking orders, telling people where they can park, how they should behave. But I never thought she'd go this far." Rachel paused, taking a deep breath. "I was in my living room when I heard the argument." Gloria was yelling at James about parking in her spot. I thought it was ridiculous. I've seen James park there before. He wasn't blocking anyone, and it wasn't even close to anyone else's space. But then, I heard the gunshot. I rushed outside as soon as I could. Officer Brooks nodded, encouraging Rachel to continue. What did you see when you went outside? I saw James on the ground, and Gloria was standing there with the gun in her hand, just staring at him like it was nothing. I couldn't believe it. She didn't even look scared. She didn't look like she was sorry, Rachel said, her eyes welling up with tears. She just stood there, like she had done nothing wrong. And when I asked her what happened, she didn't even apologize. She just said she had to teach him a lesson. Rachel's voice faltered, but she steadied herself. I don't know how anyone could think that was okay. She should be in jail for what she did. Helen had arrived at the police station shortly after, hearing Rachel's testimony and offering her own. James was just trying to help me. He didn't deserve this, she said softly, her voice breaking. He was doing everything right. He was just trying to take care of his sick mother. With Rachel's testimony and Helen's, it became increasingly clear to the police that this wasn't a case of self-defense, it was a case of misplaced anger and obsessive control. And it was only a matter of time before the full truth of what happened would be revealed. The days leading up to the trial felt like a blur of meetings, legal papers, and endless hours of preparation. Helen had never thought she'd be involved in something like this. She had always tried to stay out of the chaos of the world around her, but now, her family was caught in the middle of a legal battle that seemed both surreal and inevitable. She couldn't escape the weight of it, not with the constant reminder of her son's pain and the anger that still burned in her chest. Helen sat at the small kitchen table, her eyes scanning through the piles of paperwork. Claire Davis, their lawyer, had laid out a strategy that involved calling witnesses, presenting evidence of Gloria's history of controlling behavior, and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the shooting was unnecessary, reckless, and a result of Gloria's delusions. But even with the evidence, Helen knew that courtrooms didn't always deal in facts. The defense would do everything they could to twist the story, to make it sound like Gloria was justified in her actions. "Mom, are you okay?" James asked, his voice soft as he sat down across from her. Helen looked up, offering a faint smile. She had been so focused on preparing for the trial that she hadn't noticed how tense James looked. He had been through so much, and the thought of him having to relive the trauma in front of strangers was unbearable. "I'm fine," she replied, though the exhaustion was evident in her tone. "It's just a lot to handle. I keep thinking about the trial, about what's going to happen. Will they believe us? Will they see what she did?" James placed his hand over hers, his touch grounding her in that moment. "We have the truth on our side. We'll get through this. Together." The comfort of his words didn't quite erase the anxiety that gripped Helen, but it helped. As the trial approached, Helen could only hold on to the hope that justice would prevail. That Gloria would finally face the consequences of her reckless actions. The courtroom was a tense, silent space as the trial began. The air was thick with anticipation, each moment dragging as both sides prepared to present their case. Helen sat in the front row, her hands trembling in her lap. James, sitting beside her, gripped her hand tightly, trying to give her strength, though he too looked uneasy. His shoulder still ached from the bullet wound, and every moment felt like a reminder of the violence that had disrupted their lives. Claire Davis, their attorney, stood tall, confident, and poised as she addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear how a woman, motivated by a misplaced sense of ownership over a parking space, committed an unforgivable act of violence. My client, Helen Carter's son, James, was shot by the defendant, Gloria Michaels, after parking in what she believed was her spot. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't an act of fear. This was an act of pure aggression." Helen's stomach tightened as Claire continued to outline the case. She knew what had happened, but hearing it from Claire, hearing the cold reality of it all laid out so simply, made her feel the depth of the injustice once again. "We will show you the evidence, the witness statements, including the testimony from Rachel Flynn, who saw the entire incident unfold. We will show you the clear fact that James was parked in an empty space, doing nothing more than dropping off his sick mother. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't in the wrong." But Gloria Michaels decided to take matters into her own hands, escalating a minor dispute into a life-threatening situation. As Claire spoke, Helen watched Gloria across the room. Gloria sat with her arms folded, her eyes stone-cold and unfazed by the proceedings. There was no sign of regret or remorse in her expression, only a deep, unsettling sense of entitlement. The defense attorney, a tall, thin man named Richard Stone, stood up next. His voice was smooth and calculated as he began to present Gloria's side of the story. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client was simply protecting what was hers. When Mr. Carter parked in what she rightfully considers her space, she felt a genuine threat to her property. She asked him to move, but he refused. He didn't listen to her warnings. He ignored the rules, and in that moment, Gloria Michaels was left with no choice but to defend herself. Yes, she pulled a weapon, but she did so out of a reasonable belief that her safety was in jeopardy. This is a case of self-defense, not assault." Helen's heart sank as Stone spoke. It was all so twisted, so completely distorted. James had never been a threat. He had simply parked to help his mother, to make her comfortable. But in the eyes of the defense, he had become the villain, and Gloria had been painted as the victim of an unjustified challenge to her authority. The hours seemed to drag on, the weight of the testimony settling heavily in the room. After what felt like an eternity, the judge called for a brief recess. Helen stood up, her legs feeling like lead beneath her. She walked outside the courtroom for a moment of respite, needing air, needing to clear her mind. The evidence was strong, but she couldn't shake the worry that Gloria might get away with it. James followed her, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Mom, we're doing the right thing. The truth is on our side. I know this is hard, but we have to believe it'll be enough." "I know," Helen said, but her voice wavered. "But what if it isn't enough? What if they don't believe us?" James placed his hand on her shoulder, pulling her into a brief hug. "We won't know until the verdict. But no matter what happens, we've already won. We're standing up for what's right. That's what matters." They returned to the courtroom, their hearts heavy with anticipation. The jury was filing back in, and the judge was ready to announce the verdict. The room went silent once more as everyone waited for the final word. The foreman of the jury stood, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Gloria Michaels, guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon." A gasp swept through the room. Helen's heart stopped for a moment before it began to race again. She turned to James, her eyes wide, but he was already smiling, a quiet, relieved smile that spoke volumes. Gloria's face went white with disbelief as she stood, the weight of the verdict sinking in. The officers moved to arrest her, but her defiant gaze remained locked on the jury. There was no remorse, only the flicker of anger in her eyes. The judge spoke again, but Helen wasn't listening anymore. She looked at her son, her heart full of gratitude and a deep sense of justice. They had fought for this moment, and now it had come. As Gloria was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom began to clear. The case was over, but for Helen and James, the emotional weight of it all had only just begun to lift. Justice had been served, and they could finally begin to heal. Helen squeezed her son's hand, feeling the weight of the past few months lifting off her shoulders. The fight was over, and they had won. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial entered its final phase. After weeks of preparation, witness testimony, and mounting evidence, the confrontation was about to reach its peak. Helen sat in the front row, her hand clenched tightly around James's, who was seated beside her. The emotional weight of the trial had worn them both thin, but there was no turning back now. They had come this far. They had fought for justice, for the truth to be heard, and now the final moment had arrived. At the front of the room, Claire Davis, their attorney, stood tall, her calm demeanor masking the intense pressure that came with a case like this. She addressed the jury, her voice clear and steady as she laid out their case one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Claire began, her gaze sweeping across the room, "what we have here today is a simple matter of a family trying to go about their lives, trying to live in peace, when one woman, a woman obsessed with control, decided to take matters into her own hands. My clients, Helen and James Carter, were simply trying to go about their day when Gloria Michaels, armed and irrational, took it upon herself to shoot James after he parked in what she called her spot. A dispute over a parking space should never have escalated into a shooting. It never should have happened." Claire paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But the truth is simple. James was not trespassing. He was not a threat. He was simply trying to care for his sick mother. And yet, Gloria Michaels, in a moment of unchecked rage, pulled a gun and shot him. The law is clear, there was no justification for this. This was not self-defense. This was a crime. And today, we are here to ensure that Gloria Michaels faces the consequences of her actions." Helen felt a swell of pride for Claire, for her ability to speak the truth with such clarity. She knew that this was the moment of reckoning. The truth had been spoken. Now it was up to the jury to decide. On the other side of the room, Gloria Michaels sat quietly, her lawyer standing beside her. Her cold, detached expression never wavered, even as Claire finished her opening statement. It was clear she still didn't believe she had done anything wrong. The courtroom shifted as Gloria's defense attorney, Robert Stone, rose from his seat. He was a tall man, always well-dressed, exuding the kind of polished confidence that came with years of experience. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen, as he turned to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his tone calm but calculated. "What we have here is not a simple case of a shooting. This is a case of self-defense. My client, Gloria Michaels, was acting within her rights when she defended her property." Helen felt her heart sink. She knew this was coming, but hearing it aloud made the weight of it unbearable. Robert continued, his eyes flicking toward Gloria, who sat quietly, as if she were above the proceedings. "You'll hear from my client that she had no choice but to protect herself when James Carter refused to follow her instructions. This was not a matter of a parking space. This was a matter of safety. Gloria Michaels had every right to defend what she believed was hers. When Mr. Carter parked in her spot, he violated her personal space, and when he refused to move, Gloria felt threatened." There was a murmur from the jury as Robert's words took hold. Helen could feel the frustration building in her chest. It was hard to listen to such a distorted version of the truth, to hear Gloria portrayed as the victim. But she knew this was the game the defense played, to twist the narrative, to make them seem like the aggressors. "Now, I know that my client's actions may seem harsh," Robert continued, his voice growing more insistent. "But in that moment, she feared for her life. In a situation where emotions were running high and an unknown person was defying her orders, my client's instincts took over. She acted out of self-preservation. It was not a decision made lightly, but it was the only choice she had at that moment." Helen's hands clenched into fists in her lap, the injustice of it all cutting through her like a knife. Gloria had not acted in self-defense. She had acted out of sheer entitlement, out of a desperate need to control something, anything, around her. And now, her lawyer was using that very need to paint her as a victim, a woman who had been forced to resort to violence to protect herself. "But that's not the reality of what happened," Helen whispered to James, her voice trembling. "She wasn't scared. She wasn't defending herself. She just shot him." Robert Stone was still speaking, his words falling like stones into the quiet of the room. Gloria Michaels is not a criminal. She is a woman who felt threatened, and she acted to protect herself. That is the truth you will see as we present the rest of the evidence. After the defense had made its opening statements, it was time for Helen to take the stand. She walked slowly to the witness box, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She had spent the last few weeks reliving the day her son had been shot, but nothing compared to the moment of having to speak those words aloud in front of strangers. As she took the oath, she looked up at the jury, her eyes focused and steady, though her insides were trembling. This was her chance to tell the truth, to make them see what had really happened. "Mrs. Carter," Claire began, her voice gentle but firm. "Can you please tell the court what happened on the day your son was shot?" Helen took a deep breath. It was a normal day. James had been taking care of me, helping me with my illness. He was just trying to park so he could bring me inside. He parked in an empty spot near the entrance. There was no one else around, and I never thought it would cause any trouble. She paused for a moment, steadying herself. But then Gloria came outside. She started yelling at James, telling him to move the car. He tried to explain that he was just dropping me off, but she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't stop. And then, she pulled out a gun. It all happened so quickly. I didn't even have time to react before the shot was fired. Helen's voice broke, but she fought to hold it together. James wasn't a threat. He wasn't even near her. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to help me. And she shot him. Right there. In front of me. She wiped away a tear that had fallen down her cheek, her heart aching for the son who had been caught in the middle of a senseless act of violence. He didn't deserve this. No one does. Helen turned to face the jury. "I just want you to understand. This wasn't self-defense. This was a shooting over a parking space. And my son is the one who's paying the price for it." Her words hung in the air, the silence in the room a heavy weight. She had spoken the truth, and now, it was up to the jury to decide whether or not that truth would matter. James Carter's vision swirled as he lay in the hospital bed, his entire body racked with pain. His right shoulder was bandaged tightly, but the memories of that fateful day kept clawing at him. The piercing sound of the gunshot, the excruciating agony as the bullet tore through his flesh, and the cold, empty look on Gloria Michaels's face as she stood over him still haunted him. The shock had initially left him numb, but now, in the stark silence of the hospital room, the reality of what had happened crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying to help his sick mother, only to find himself on the receiving end of an irrational, violent outburst. But it wasn't just the physical pain that gnawed at him. It was the feeling of helplessness, the helplessness of being at the mercy of someone else's actions. He had no control over what had happened. His fate had been sealed by someone else's irrationality, and there was nothing he could have done to change it. James could hear his mother's voice in the next room, speaking to the police, recounting the details of the shooting. She was trying to be strong, but James could tell from the tone of her voice that she was still shaken to her core. She had nearly lost him, her son, and it was something neither of them would ever forget. As his mind drifted, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Helen entered the room, her face drawn with worry, but her eyes filled with love and determination. She had been there every step of the way, taking care of him when he was at his most vulnerable, holding his hand through every agonizing moment. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, sitting by his bed and taking his hand. "The doctors said you're stable now. We'll get through this." James's lips trembled as he squeezed her hand, feeling the overwhelming weight of the situation. "I don't know if I can, Mom. I don't know if I can go through this, and I don't know if I can face her. If I can face her again." Helen stroked his hand gently, her voice full of quiet strength. "We will face her, James. We'll face her together. And we'll make sure she never gets away with this. What she did to you, what she did to our family, it's unforgivable. We will make sure justice is done. I promise." Days later, the trial had begun. James was no longer physically weak, but the emotional scars were still raw, still fresh. He had been called to testify. He had to recount the shooting, the events that had led up to that moment, and the terrible aftermath. It was the moment of truth, the moment where his story would finally be heard. Helen sat beside him in the courtroom, her hand resting on his as they both looked toward the defendant's table. Gloria Michaels, now in handcuffs, sat quietly, her cold, emotionless expression never faltering. She had not apologized for what she had done. She hadn't shown any remorse for shooting a young man who had done nothing wrong except park in a spot she considered hers. James could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. The jury, the judge, the prosecutor, everyone was waiting for him to speak. But how could he? How could he make them understand the pain he had felt when the bullet hit his shoulder, when he thought he was going to die, when he had feared for his life in the hands of someone who had no right to do what she did? When his name was called, James stood slowly, his legs shaky but determined. The entire courtroom watched as he made his way to the witness stand. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, could feel the sweat gathering on the back of his neck. But he had to do this. He had to tell them what had happened, so that Gloria Michaels would be held accountable for her actions. "I parked in an empty spot," James began, his voice shaky but growing steadier as he spoke. "I wasn't blocking anyone. I was just dropping my mom off, making sure she was comfortable. And then Gloria came out of her apartment, started yelling at me about how I was in her spot. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand, but she didn't listen. She kept getting angrier, saying that I was disrespecting her. And then she pulled out a gun." The courtroom went silent. The jury's eyes were locked on James as he continued, his voice growing firmer. "She didn't give me a chance to explain. She didn't care about who I was or why I was there. She just shot me. In the shoulder. I didn't even see it coming. I thought I was going to die." Helen's breath hitched beside him as she heard her son's testimony. The pain in his voice, the fear that had been relived in those few sentences, was almost too much to bear. The memory of that day, the fear, the helplessness, was alive again. But there was a sense of strength in his words too. He had faced down the darkness, and he was still standing. James took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't know why she did it. I don't know what I did to make her feel like she had to shoot me. But I know one thing. I didn't deserve it. No one deserves that. I didn't deserve to be shot for something so small." Gloria's face remained unmoved, but James could see the crack in her defense. She couldn't justify what she had done. Not now. Not after hearing his words. "Thank you, James," the prosecutor said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder as he stepped down from the witness stand. "Your bravery today is going to make all the difference." As James returned to his seat, he caught Helen's eye. She nodded slightly, her lips trembling with emotion. They had done it. They had faced the nightmare, and now it was time for Gloria to answer for her actions. The following days of the trial were a blur of closing statements, rebuttals, and intense legal arguments. But for James and Helen, the hardest part was over. They had told their truth. They had stood up to Gloria Michaels and had given the jury everything they needed to know. Now, it was in their hands. The verdict came down quickly. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning to the courtroom. The room fell silent as the foreman stood and read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Gloria Michaels, guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon." The words rang out like a bell in the quiet room. James's breath caught in his chest as he turned to Helen. Her eyes were wide, filled with relief, but there was still a look of disbelief on her face. They had won. It wasn't just about the victory in court. It was about the justice that had been denied to them for so long. Gloria, sitting in the defendant's chair, looked as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Her face remained stoic, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes now. The smug sense of control she had carried with her throughout the trial had disappeared. As the judge declared the sentencing phase, James felt a sense of closure settle over him. It wouldn't erase the pain, the trauma, or the fear that still clung to him. But it was a step forward. He had been given back his voice, his agency. He had stood up and fought for what was right. And in the end, it had made all the difference. Helen squeezed James's hand tightly. "We did it, James. We did it." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. It wasn't over, not yet. But they had taken the first step toward healing. And for the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to believe that there was hope for the future. The darkness had been overwhelming, but the light of justice had finally broken through. The morning light filtered through the blinds of the small apartment, casting long shadows on the walls as Helen sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The weight of the trial had finally lifted, and though it hadn't been easy, the burden of uncertainty was gone. For the first time in weeks, there was a tentative peace in the air. James was sitting on the couch, staring out the window, his face thoughtful but peaceful. The pain in his shoulder had diminished with each passing day, but the emotional scars, the haunting memories of that moment when Gloria had shot him, remained etched in his mind. But he was healing, both physically and mentally, even if it felt like it would take years to fully erase the fear and anxiety that had taken over his life. The room felt quiet now. There were no sirens, no voices raised in anger, no fear pressing against their chests. There was only the soft murmur of everyday life, a life that, for once, felt like it was beginning to return to normal. The air felt different too. Lighter. For the first time, Helen allowed herself to breathe, really breathe, without the heavy burden of fear and uncertainty hanging over her. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding in until now. Now, there was space for them both to heal. The storm had passed, and in its wake, they were left with the peace that they had fought so hard to reclaim. James turned toward her, a small smile on his face. "You okay, Mom?" Helen nodded, the warmth of his smile filling her heart. "Yeah. I think we're going to be all right, James." The aftermath of the trial had been a quiet, almost surreal period. There had been a few phone calls from friends and family, checking in, offering support. Some well-meaning neighbors had come by, dropping off flowers or cards, trying to reassure them that they were safe now, that justice had been served. But all of that was just noise in the background of their lives. Helen found herself often lost in thought, sitting in the stillness of her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She couldn't escape the image of James on the ground, blood pouring from his shoulder, the pain and terror in his eyes as he cried out for help. The sound of that gunshot still reverberated in her ears, like an echo that would never fade. Every time she closed her eyes, it was as if it had just happened all over again. She had always been strong for her family, after all, someone had to be. But now, with the weight of the trial lifted, she realized just how much of herself she had pushed aside to get through the chaos. The trauma she had experienced had left its mark, but there was no time for her to process it then. She had been too busy trying to save her son. James, too, had his moments. He rarely spoke about the fear he had felt when Gloria pulled the trigger, when he thought he was going to die right there in the parking lot. The shooting had rattled him to the core, but he didn't talk about it. He couldn't. The memory of his mother's frantic cries, of being unable to move or defend himself, stayed with him. Even now, when he looked into Helen's eyes, he sometimes saw that flash of terror, and it reminded him of what they had been through. But there was hope now. They had survived. And slowly, they would heal. But Helen knew that healing would take time, it would take effort. The scars of that day wouldn't fade overnight. But they had each other. And that, for now, was enough. A few weeks had passed since the trial, and while life had begun to settle into a new routine, there was still a lingering heaviness. The media frenzy had died down, and the neighborhood had mostly returned to its usual state of quiet. Gloria Michaels had been sentenced to prison, her conviction for aggravated assault carrying a significant sentence. But despite the legal victory, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just about the trial or the verdict, it was about the world around them. About how fragile everything could be. How, in a single moment, a simple parking dispute could turn into a life-or-death situation. How, in the blink of an eye, everything could change. One afternoon, as Helen and James sat together in their living room, their thoughts settled into a calm silence. James had just returned from an appointment with his therapist, and though he didn't always share the details of his sessions, Helen could see the small improvements in him. He was talking more, laughing again, and slowly regaining the sense of normalcy he had lost. "Mom, I was thinking," James began, breaking the quiet. "What if we move? Just start fresh. A new place. Somewhere we don't have to worry about parking spots or people like her." Helen looked at him, her heart aching as she took in his words. She had considered the same thing. Maybe they could leave it all behind, the memories, the fear, the anger, and start somewhere new. Somewhere they could just be a family again, free from the chaos that had nearly torn them apart. But deep down, Helen knew that moving wouldn't change what had happened. They would always carry the scars of that day with them, no matter where they went. But they would be together. They had survived. And that, Helen realized, was what mattered most. "I don't know if moving is the answer, James," Helen said softly, her voice steady. "But I do know that we're not defined by what happened. We've made it through, and we'll keep moving forward. Together." James smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Together," he echoed, squeezing his mother's hand. As the sun began to set, the light streaming through the window, Helen felt a sense of calm settle over her. The storm had passed. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they would walk it together. They had survived the darkest of times, and they were stronger for it. No matter what the future held, they would always have each other. And that was enough.